Let's take a look at the footprint of the Wagner Group on the African continent. They are in countries such as war-torn Sudan, Mali as well, which is also experiencing some instability. For that conversation, we speak to Peter Fabricius. He is an foreign policy analyst. Peter, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. What do we need to understand about Wagner's footprint on the continent and its DNA?
Hi, dear. Yeah, its footprint has been quite large, actually. You mentioned those countries. It's also the Central African Republic. It's apparently extending its, tentacles into Burkina Faso. It's had one kind of presence or another in some other countries. It briefly fought in Mozambique a few years ago against the Islamist insurgents. It's had some influence in Madagascar, not military, but apparently trying to buy, the allegiance of candidates in the last presidential election. In Libya, it's been quite a big fighting force on behalf of the rebel leader Khalifa Haftar. So it's been, and some analysts think it was. We don't know now, but was certainly expanding.
Is this unusual? I mean, in these areas that you speak of, you've also got the United Nations peacekeeping forces in some of them. Yeah,
so it's interesting that you mentioned that, because in Mali, for example, where they've gained a major foothold and displaced the French forces, actually, they've asked for the UN peacekeeping force to be removed. It's happening this week. I'm not sure if it might not even be today, and that's caused a lot of concern, because the suggestion seems to be that the military junta that took over there in a coup recently is trying to get the UN out of the way so they can carry on, doing what they do against the civilian population without any hindrance.
Is the fear of this group justified when it comes to the continent, where some analysts are playing out worst-case scenarios in light of what happened on the weekend? What threat do they pose?
Yeah, I've just done a report, actually, that's in the Daily Maverick, based on an extensive investigation by the Sentry, which is a U.S. Advocacy group for human rights around the world, especially in Africa, and they go into great detail about the atrocities which Wagner has committed in Central African Republic, basically in propping up that president, Archangel Tradera, and also just cleansing and sweeping, as they call it, anybody who gets in the way as they seize mineral resources in particular. Which is their kind of barter arrangement for providing security, the quid pro quo. They provide very muscular and brutal security, wiping out the opposition to Tradera, and Tradera gives them free access to whatever minerals they want, regardless of who happens to be mining them at the time. So they are a pretty nefarious influence, I think.
From MONUSCO to Wagner to other interventions, where you're also finding that there are countries that are setting up military bases. You think of a country like Djibouti, for instance. Then you ask yourself, to what end? What intervention can this here particular continent offer when it comes to security, where you don't have people coming in and taking advantage of the situation?
Yeah, I mean, you're pointing to a very fundamental problem here, and that is the inability of many African countries to really extend their control over the entire territory of their countries, which allows all kinds of other forces to seize control. I mean, you look at the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, where there's a numberless armed rebel groups that are roaming the countryside and terrorizing the population. So ultimately, if countries could secure their own territories, and provide security to their populations, we wouldn't have groups like this. But in the absence of that, which is clearly the case in many countries, I think it would, you know, one would agree that having the kind of peacekeeping force that you had in countries like Mali and so on from the French and the US were certainly better than this.
What is the long-term consequence, Peter, for the African continent not to have a handle on the security situation? You need only think of a young woman from South Africa who went to Sudan for work, and we carried that live on the channel, where she came back with just her toiletry bag. And so when you find opportunities elsewhere on the continent, that country is then thrown off. To what end? Just how sustainable is this?
Yeah, that is a problem. Look, I mean, just before going into the answer to that question, there's obviously an issue here about what impact this attempted insurrection by the leader of Wagner, Yevgeny Prigozhin, over the weekend will have on the operations of Wagner in Africa. And it seemed like that Wagner might be dissolved. There was that suggestion as part of the peace deal which they secured Putin and Prigozhin on Saturday. But yesterday, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov actually said that their Wagner operations would continue in CAR and Mali in particular, and you can see why, because they are a kind of a proxy influence for Russia, and which Russia uses to counter the influence of the West. So that is the danger here that we're facing in the wider context of this war in Ukraine, that it has kind of reactivated, if you like, a kind of Cold War standoff in Africa, you know, the kind we had before the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that is very worrying.
Foreign policy analyst Peter Fabricius, thank you very much for your time this afternoon.